I'm going to preface this video by saying I'm an actual human being. This is my real voice. There's no AI generated content in this video at all, no AI script, no AI imagery, right? I'm getting really tired of that stuff. So I think it's important to put this out there. I think it's valuable to put this out there that an actual human being thought about these things and wanted to share their thoughts with the YouTube audience, right? So now let's get into the subject at hand. We can do an interesting thought experiment by asking a seemingly simple question, and that is, where is the mind? That is, where is the I think, therefore I am um, mind, the verbal and symbolic reasoning mode of consciousness, the thing that many people equate with their self, right? Their ego, whatever. There's a number of different labels for this thing. But yeah, where is that thing? Where is that entity? Um, The obvious answer to that, or the probably the knee-jerk reaction to that question many people would have is, oh, obviously it's in my head, it's in my brain, right? That verbal and symbolic mode of reasoning consciousness is in my brain, that thing that I identify as myself. This is depicted in some movies and some TV shows, right? With a comical scene of a guy driving around a body, right? Like there's a little man inside of your head driving your body around. Um, And I think, yeah, that's what the easy and obvious answer to the question actually is. And I think that comes about from our kinesthetic sense, right? It comes about from this kind of internal model that we have that actually represents our body, right? So it's what helps you grab an object off the counter, right? Grab a cup of coffee. It helps you walk down the street, right? And anyway, this map puts our self in our head, probably because that's where our eyes are. So if we had our eyes in our stomach or something like that, or in our chest, even if our brain was still in our head, maybe that's where our sense of self would be, right? Anyway, I think we can get at a more useful, uh, maybe more abstract way of looking at this concept if we ask a more general question, and that is, where is information? Because I think our mind is actually information, right? It's information being processed like a computer program or whatever, right? So when we ask, so where is information? And so rather than getting into electronics or computers or whatever, the storage and representation of information and those things, let's talk about a real world, 3D reality world example of something that seems like information itself. In that thing, or that example, or the example I want to use for that is tree rings. Tree rings seem like a really great example of information in the 3D physical reality world, apart from humans, apart from the human mind. Before there were people, there were trees. When people are gone from this earth, there will probably still be trees, right? And trees will continue to form tree rings. Trees formed tree rings before there were people. So it seems like a really great example of information that's in the 3D physical reality world, right? But when you start to think about it in more detail, you'll see that the information is maybe encoded in a tree ring, but it's actually not present in the tree ring. And it's not really anywhere in the 3D physical reality world, if you think about it, right? So let's take the example of answering how much rainfall there was per year by analyzing tree rings, right? So where is that information, right? Like, where does that information actually exist? It's basically in the mind, in the training, in the studies of lots of people over the years. So it's in the mind of the person who's interpreting the tree rings, essentially, right? So when this expert looks at tree rings and they can interpret, okay, it rained this much per year, that information that's encoded in the tree ring is kind of played back in the mind of the person doing the interpreting, right? They have this model in their mind that's been produced by studying tree rings in general, and then they're able to kind of run information that they glean from studying the tree rings through this model and produce whatever result, right? So yeah, the information is not really present in the tree ring. It's present in the mind of the person interpreting the tree ring, right? You could say it's encoded in the tree ring, but it's kind of extracted by the person the expert who's looking at these tree rings, right? So the answer to that question, where is the information, is a little bit more complicated than it initially seemed, right? Especially from this tree ring example. The information is actually not present in the 3D physical reality world at all, right? It can be encoded in the world, attached to the world, it could arise from the world, whatever you want to say, but it's not really there. It's in a different place altogether. And we're forced to use a term like place or space or whatever because our mind, our, this, there, I think, therefore I am type of mind, um, grew up in the 3D physical reality world and models everything off of concepts that extracted essentially or that are built out of the 3D physical reality world, right? And so when we use the interrogative where, we are uh, left like stumbling around looking around for something like information in the same way we would look for a pair of shoes or our car keys or whatever, right? Well, it's got to be in a physical location because um, our notion of location arises from the 3D physical reality world. But in fact, the information is just somewhere else. And the term where is altogether wrong. And almost any term you would try to come up with would not be correct, right? You'd say, okay, it's in a different plane, it's in a different dimension, whatever. Notice these are all kind of spatial concepts. So it's not a spatial concept, it's not a where, it's just something different than anything in the 3D physical reality world. It arises from things in the 3D physical reality world, changes in things, relationships between things like a distance or whatever. Um, right? These concepts originate essentially in the 3D physical reality world, but they map through our model of the 3D physical reality world, right? So asking where is information is analogous or is really the same thing as asking where is the mind, and the answer is nowhere, and it's the wrong question, right? So this is a really sort of interesting concept to try to think through, right? And we can use this as a kind of a launching pad or as a starting point. Notice that we keep using these, or that people often use these kind of 3D physical reality world concepts like starting point. Okay, we're starting at this point, even though this is all just kind of a conceptual discussion. And as we march down this path, right, of analyzing subsequent topics, this provides a really useful sort of tool for understanding different aspects about the mind and the world, essentially, which is really the topic of this video and will be the topic of this channel. So one of the bizarre, kind of startling conclusions you could draw from this line of inquiry is the human mind, that is this I think, therefore I am mode of consciousness, is kind of alien to the 3D physical reality world, right? In fundamental ways, it is completely alien, right? It's in this information dimension. But in other ways, it's sort of attached to the 3D physical reality world, right? Through your senses, through your body chemistry, through your electrical and chemical impulses in your brain, right? You, that is this information entity, are attached to the 3D physical reality. You arise from the 3D physical reality, but this thing that is you is somewhere else altogether, or something else altogether apart from the 3D physical reality. All right, so people would say, oh, that's your soul, that's your ego, whatever. Put these different labels on this thing to try to understand it. Um, but, it still remains kind of alien to this earth, to this 3D physical reality. Um, and I think because of that, this mode of consciousness, this entity that we consider to be ourself, has a hard time answering some pretty fundamental questions about its own existence and the nature of 3D physical reality and its relationship to it, right? Two of the big questions would be, what happens after I die? Or where was I before I was born, right? So if you start to delve into this question in the terms that I've been using so far, you can rephrase it a little bit, right? You can say, where is this entity, right? This 3D, or where is this entity, this information entity, with respect to the body? So what happens after the body dies and ceases functioning, right? What happens to this kind of information entity? And the answer is nobody knows. Nobody really knows at all, right? Where were you? That is this information entity before you were born. Where were you when you were a toddler or a baby, right? Like people will naturally assume or will extrapolate or interpolate from their existence, that is their existence as this information entity. They will assume, well, I must have been there when I was a toddler because, if I came from my brain, I rise from my brain, I must have been there when I was a toddler, must have been there when I was 5, 6 years old or whatever. But if you try to replay your memories, right, from your childhood, if you're like me, there'll be just kind of spotty memories left over from, the time when you were, I don't know, 4 or 5. And then maybe your sense of self, right, this information entity didn't really take a solid form that you would recognize as continuous with your current state if you're an adult until you were maybe 8, 9, 10 years old, something like that. Probably not even as young as, not even then. Maybe it was later, right, for some people. But yeah, if I cast my mind back to my start, my origin, there's just nothing there either, right? I can't really say, with any definite certainty when, kind of the tapestry of memories and, experiences, when that actually starts, when I was like a conscious participant in my own life, right? Like I'm not exactly sure when that happened. And, maybe, for me, it's like when I was 8 or 10 years old, something like that, if I'm honest. But anyway, yeah. So I think these kinds of big questions, they're actually not answerable to the mode of consciousness itself, right? Like the entity, this entity that I think therefore I am entity, doesn't have the means to answer these questions, right? And it's a little bit like a one divided by zero problem, or really any number divided by zero problem, right? When you go to answer these questions using the tools that you have available to your consciousness, you get no answer. You just get this kind of spinning kind of nonsense thinking, right? There just isn't an answer, right? It's a little bit like the concept of a Zen cone or something, like what's the sound of one hand clapping, right? You can imagine there should be an answer to that question, but obviously there isn't, right? These kind of paradoxical things. There's no answer there. There's just the void. There's nothing there, right? You can't escape sort of from the matrix that you inhabit, right? This verbal and symbolic reasoning mode of consciousness. You can't really get out of it. You can't get to those fundamental things through the terms of the verbal and symbolic reasoning mode of consciousness, right? I think that's sort of a key thing as well. So yeah, there's no answer to these questions. You just have this endless spinning of like a divide by zero error. It's undefined, right? If you're going to be rigorous in thinking about it, it's just kind of undefined. So then this leads to some really interesting behavior, right? There are several ways that people try to fill this void in the center of human consciousness, right? This divide by zero problem. People have, over the centuries, the millennia, probably tried to fill it in a variety of ways. And I'm going to start off a discussion about that, or a monologue, I should say, about that with cults and cult-like behavior. Um, One thing I should say about cults is I think that they're really common, right? They span a range of categories, from very extreme types of cults to very mundane cult-like behavior, right? So an example of the mundane cult-like behavior is um, consumer product cults, corporate cults, right? You have a Tesla fanboy cult, but if you go through YouTube and watch videos about electric cars, you'll see those people, especially a video that's critical of an electric car, you'll see those people announce themselves and their beliefs, right? There's an AI cult now. Um, there's an Apple cult. There's sports cults, right? There's participatory sports cults, like there's a running cult, there's a cycling cult, etc., right? You can think of a lot of different examples of those things. And in those cases, those really mundane things, like the definition of the cult is, or the purpose of the cult is to um, provide what a person perceives of as an enjoyable way to spend their time, right? With maybe some kind of positive outcome in the case of these participatory sports cults, right? Like you're going to get exercise or whatever. So Shinrikyo is a group, a cult that's on the other end of that spectrum of cults, right? So you've got these fairly healthy, innocuous cult-like behaviors or activities or groups, something like a group of runners or a group of cyclists or whatever. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got this group like Aum Shinrikyo, which is like a stereotypical James Bond villain type thing, right? Um, they're death cult. They have this end of the world uh, doomsday scenario in mind that they're trying to precipitate, right? And I think this is a really interesting group to look at because it is so stereotypical and obvious, right? It's a really easy thing to analyze. And so I'm going to start to go through the analysis, but then also analyze the analysis itself, right? So that's that's going to be the recipe for a lot of these videos. So let's go through the, quote unquote analysis of this group. So what are the ingredients for a cult, right? Like where does it really come from? So in a lot of cases, people will point to the cult leader and its leadership, right? Somebody like Jim Jones or whatever, or this guy who is the leader of Shinrikyo, this Shoko Asahara guy. That was his self given name, right? He was born with a different name. But anyway, this crazy dude, right? People think, okay, it's the cult leader, the cult leadership. That's the origin of the cults. Um, I'm going to say it's got two roots, right? It's two origin points. One is the cult leader and the leadership. The other is the people, right? And I think Japan at the time of Aum Shinrikyo was ripe for these types of groups to spring up because the structures, the religions that kind of filled this void, right, this divide by zero void for the population, had been basically worked over or destroyed a couple of times in a row. So whatever religion Japan had prior to the imperial age, right, like the late 1800s, early 1900s through World War II, imperial age, or whatever the appropriate dates are, it doesn't really matter, right? Around that time, the World War II time, the age that culminated in the World War II time, whatever religion Japan had before that got reworked into this imperial model to make the emperor this godlike character, etc. Build up mythology around that, structure people's lives around that. Then that got destroyed, obviously, after World War II, and the United States rebooted Japan, destroyed Japan, rebooted Japan with new institutions, etc. Right? So the entities, the void-filling entities that had been there for the Japanese people for however long were completely destroyed. Right? Then the other thing that happened in the 80s in Japan, 1980s in Japan, was the country became fabulously wealthy. Right? Now, how much of that wealth trickled down to the general public, I don't know, but you created a certain amount of wealth that was shared among the ruling class and the wealthy people, at least. So, the thing that wealth gives a country, or people, I should say, in a country, the thing that wealth gives those people is leisure time, right? One of the things that it gives them is leisure time, obviously. So now you have a bunch of rich people with plenty of leisure time who had all their religious institutions destroyed a couple of times in a row, right? So this group of people is sitting around trying to think about these big questions like, what's the meaning of life? What happens after I die? Blah, 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 right? The void questions, right? Things that you can't really answer with your, I think, therefore I am form of human consciousness. So this group is sitting there thinking about this stuff. They don't have any answer to it. All the prior institutions that claim to have such an answer are destroyed. And so those people are essentially sitting ducks for con men, aka cult leaders, to come in and tell them the way things really are, right? To give them a new religion, to give them some structure to fill this void in. So this guy, this Shoko Asahara guy, is a great example of a cult leader, right? This sort of con man figure that comes to dominate a cult. Um, I think in his case, though, he's a true believer in his bullshit, right? The story that he's selling to the public, he actually fundamentally believes. There's other cult leaders who are more cynical, right? And they are scamming, like knowingly scamming the public. And in their mind, they are taking on the position of leadership begrudgingly, right? That's something that they necessarily don't want to do, or that they don't necessarily want to do, but they think, oh, it's kind of necessary because the public wants this to be done, right? This group of people that has this void problem, this divide by zero problem, needs to be told what to think and what to do. And for whatever random reason, that person, that cult leader, ends up in the position to do that. And so they collect all the benefits of being a cult leader from the cult, right? It's like a job. It's a kind of a lifetime actor job. But in the case of this Shoko Asahara guy, I think he was a true believer. So he believed his own bullshit. And the reason I say that is he seems to fit that pattern, right? So you got this dude who was born with a problem with his eyes, so he's fully blind in one eye, partially sighted in the other eye. And then because of that, he was sent to a boarding school for the blind basically when he was just 6 years old, right? So in this Wikipedia article, there's a lot of detail missing. So did his family ever visit him again? Did they visit him daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, right? Um, were the people in the school nice? Was it abusive? Right? None of that detail is really there. So But in spite of that, right, this detail is presented. Okay, he was put in boarding school when he was 6 years old, because one would assume, or the way the story goes, the generic narrative goes, is that would be very traumatic, right? Um, it's hard to imagine, if you were a 6 year old kid being sort of abandoned by your family and having to go off and live in a school, right, full time. Um, when you're growing up as an infant into toddlerhood and like 4 or 5 years old, when you start to become more conscious of yourself, you become comfortable in your home environment, no matter what it is, right? I think if you're an abusive home, that's a different story. But in most scenarios, if your family cares about you, you have a loving family, at least people that take care of you, you'll grow in that environment and get used to it, right? Just like any other animal would, like a dog would or a cat would or child would, right? You just get used to it. Oh, this is what I'm fed. This is what my house smells like. This is what my bed is like. You have a life routine, right? And when you're that age, you would have no reason to believe things would ever change, right? So then your life is up, you experience this huge upheaval and you're cast into this completely new scenario, right? I remember going to elementary school for the first time, kindergarten. I found that very traumatic. I don't know exactly why, but I assume it's for that reason, right? I had even been to preschool, kind of conditioned to be put into this type of environment, right? The school type of environment. I had been kind of built up to that, but I still found it very traumatic. And I don't really remember exactly what was traumatic about it, but when I kind of cast my mind back and try to analyze it as much as I can with almost a complete lack of information, I think it was just that kind of disruption to my routine. Um, you know, Maybe going to preschool for a couple of hours a day, that's okay, but being stuck in kindergarten full day, right? I think back then we had a full day of kindergarten, and I think it was just a handful of days a week at that time. But even so, being stuck in school, having new adults, like rando adults, like control your life, I just couldn't deal with that, right? I think that's probably what it was. So, you know, I can't imagine that being uh, put into a boarding school, especially if you were blind, would be really traumatic. So anyway, the story here, the narrative that they're trying to sell about this Shoko Asahara guy is he was traumatized as a kid, right? So maybe because of his trauma, he turns into basically a psychopath, right? So the Wikipedia article states that He had a fantasy about ruling a kingdom of robots, right? And then he had a fantasy about becoming the prime minister of Japan, right? So he craved power. So he went from being a powerless kid to having this fantasy about like real ultimate power, right? Obviously. And then he became kind of a hippy dippy, kind of medicine man, yogi guy. And then somehow that turned into being a cult leader, right? So they just gloss over a lot of these details in the story because it's just a Wikipedia article. But the thing I want to emphasize here is that even if you had all the details about this guy's life, it would boil like in your mind, right, or in the mind of a scholar or the mind of a person analyzing all of this detail, they would boil it down to a few basic ingredients, right? Because a person's full life is too complicated to really analyze in this manner, right? It's just impossible. There's no way you can actually do it. Um, So you pick the things that you think are important that actually fit a pre-existing narrative you have in your mind, right? You have this kind of cult leader narrative in your mind. It's what a cult leader is like. So then a person will kind of hunt through all these details and find the things that match that pattern, right? And I think this is a species of a problem I would refer to as the circle, triangle, square problem, right? And this problem, the circle, triangle, square problem, is a little bit like the where is the mind question. You can do a similar thought experiment with something like a triangle. Where is a triangle? Where is a circle? Where do these things actually exist? Because if you go look around in the natural world, you're not going to find many examples. In some cases, no examples of these shapes, right? You're going to be really hard pressed to find a parallelepiped, like a thing like a rectangle or a square. You're going to be very hard pressed to find things like a triangle, but you find a handful of circles out there, like the pupil of your eye, the disk of the sun, um, and maybe a handful of other things that are really circular, like almost like a perfect circle in their natural state. But yeah, rectangles, triangles, you're going to be really hard pressed to find something that's anything like that, right? So, how did humanity come up with these shapes that don't really exist in the natural world? Where do they exist? And I'm going to give a really simple explanation here of this. I don't want to delve into this in this video. It will end up being like 5 hours long, but um, I think that they come about through a couple or from a couple of things. One is they're probably like a template in the human visual system, right? So there's these elements of the human visual system that detect lines, edges, shapes, like primitive shapes, that kind of thing. So I think those exist somewhere in our visual system, either in the brain or the retina, whatever, right? And then the other component of the circles and triangles and squares is the way you create a circle, right? Like you make a compass type thing out of a stick or, strings with a string with two sticks on it, whatever, right? The way you create that shape is an algorithm, basically, right? It's a recipe. Stick one of the sticks in the ground and swing the other one around it, keeping the string tight at all times, and you create a circle. Then you can create a numerical algorithm that does the same thing, basically, creates that shape in the virtual realm, right? The realm of the mind, whereas the physical action creates the shape in the realm of 3D reality world, right? So you take that recipe from 3D reality world, make it into a numerical recipe, and then you have, oh, circles. So there are these sort of templates that are really simple things, right? Like a circle, a triangle, etc., that form much of the basis of our overall thought process, right? Or overall thought processes of the mind, right? This entity I've been discussing throughout this video, and they help us understand and navigate the world, but they're an extreme simplification of it, right? So I think that's what's going on with this type of story as well, right? So now back to the narrative of Shinrikyo. So anyway, this guy becomes a cult leader, and he has a ripe scenario out there in Japan in the late 1980s Japan, because there's people out there craving the bullshit that he's going to sell, right? They want an answer to what happens to them after they die. They want an answer to what's the meaning of life, how does the world work, etc. Like these things that they can't really answer, that nobody has an answer to. then you get this kind of crazy dude who invents this sort of fantasy life for himself and a fantasy narrative about the world, and he sells it really hard to these people, and they buy it, right? And who does he sell it to, right? Like, so this is the interesting story with Aum Shinrikyo. Um, the claim is the people in Aum Shinrikyo had come up with religion that was aimed at the quote unquote elites, right? So it wasn't a religion for the common man, for the man on the street, for the kind of the bums, the vagrants, the homeless people. No, it was a religion for the elites, right? So they started to pull in um, people who were uh, well funded, right? People who had skills, right? People who might have a lot of money, and they formed the basis of essentially a corporation, right? So I think one of the things that's probably a missing ingredient from this narrative at this point is, you need the kind of the chief operating officer to come along to make one of these cults really work, right? So you have this sort of crazy figure, the Shoko Asahara guy. By the way, Shoko means flying child. That's one of the translations of that name. And this guy thought he could levitate from his yoga practice. So probably there were meetings where they did a magic trick basically, and this guy would levitate in a room, and then gullible people in the audience would be like, "Holy shit, superpowers, magical powers are real." And this guy is manifesting these things right in front of me. That's amazing, right? So some like real people want to believe that, right? They're like, no, the world's not mundane. When my body dies, who knows what's going to happen to my mind? They want to believe magic, and they see this guy who's basically a magician, and they just go along with it, right? So you see, they did things like, publish comic books, and right, they published anime, right? You could go watch a couple of these animes on YouTube and just see what it was all about, and it's all hinged on this kind of psychopathic leader, and people for whatever reason will glom on to that type of person and follow along, right? They'll just kind of follow along with that person, whatever they say, because that person seems to have all the answers, right? That person seems to have all the knowledge about the things that they really want to know. I want to talk about another element of this type of cult group, which I think is important. A couple of elements here in this little highlighted section in the Wikipedia article. So this group, Amshin Rikyo, had an initiation ritual, that, hazing type initiation ritual that put people through some pretty severe physical trauma. Right, the initiate would be essentially tortured. They might be given LSD. Right, they were hung upside down. They were shocked. Right, and this kind of thing is fairly common out there, right? You can think of hazing rituals in sports, right? Like in a high school football team or whatever. Hazing rituals when you become a member of a fraternity or a sorority or whatever. Um, and these rituals perform a couple of really important functions, I think, for a group like this. Um, they take the normal person, right? The seeker, right? The seeker is the person who wants answers to life's questions. They want to fill this void in their mind, this divide by zero problem. They want to solve this divide by zero problem. And for whatever reason, they're like, yeah, maybe this crazy dude with this bizarre narrative about the way the world works, maybe he really knows something, right? Another fairly common tactic from these groups is that you are given answers to the big questions by degree, right? Like you enter and you learn, okay, here's this little secret nugget, right? But it's not that important. It's just a little taste. And then if you go through all of these rituals and you maybe pay us money or whatever, you go to the next level and the next level and the next level, right? Like Freemasonry or whatever, or mystery schools from, kind of the Mediterranean classical world civilizations, right? You'll be all the mysteries, which we know, obviously, all the mysteries, the answers to the big questions you have, it will all be revealed gradually. You have to work at it though, right? Or you have to go through these levels of cleansing or whatever, right? They come up with these various schemes to rope people in. And, so you go to level one through this kind of initiatory hazing. Then once you've gone through that kind of humiliating, painful experience, your new family embraces you, right? So all your new brothers and sisters, the people who are initiated with you, now you have a common experience that is unique from the general public, right? Um, so I want to highlight one little element here in the article just because it's so close to this paragraph about the hazing. They were able to recruit people from positions of power, right? From the government, from the police force, from corporations, etc. And they were able to start to build up Shinrikyo into essentially like a corporation, right? So you get all these people who have actually good, useful skills, connections, etc., who start to join your little cult. But their loyalty is really to the cult. It's not to the corporation that they work for, or the police force, or the government, or whatever. It's actually to the cult because they're a seeker. They're looking for this knowledge. They join this cult movement. They're initiated, hazed, and now they think, okay, I'm going to get all my answers from Shoko Asahara, this crazy dude, because he must know the secrets of the universe because he can levitate, right? They might maybe do some little magic trick and make it seem like the guy's levitating. And the people who have maybe taken LSD or whatever, they're not incredulous, they're credulous, they're ready to believe, they want to believe. That's the reason that they're in the first place, right? They have these questions that they need answers to, and this guy seems to have them, and other people there seem to believe in him as well. And so, yeah, why wouldn't you go along with that? There's another element here, another lurking element that I want to highlight before continuing on the path of Aum Shinrikyo, a little aside here, and that is um, things that have been revealed in the past couple of centuries, like the details about life on Earth that have been revealed in the past couple of centuries, have kind of rendered seeking after these questions, have given like had made it even more difficult to seek after these questions, right? Like scientific knowledge about the history of the Earth, for example, like geological knowledge, something that's come about fairly recently in human history, um, has rendered pursuit of the questions of the meaning of life much more complex, right? It's kind of voided out religion to a certain extent, and has voided out kind of mythological stories and folk stories that people came up with to fill this void in, like over the millennia prior, right? So today we have a narrative about the origin of Earth, the life on Earth, that doesn't put people at the center. In fact, the human species is just one of many species on Earth, and it will certainly go extinct, right? This is something that study of geology reveals, right? The information that's presented, or the information that has been decoded from the fossil record, would lead a logical, rational person to conclude that humanity will eventually go extinct. That person also knows I will die, right? I'm a mortal person. I'm going to die, and it renders the pursuit of many things in life absurd, right? It kind of puts you in this strange position as a human consciousness, right? As a potential seeker type. Many people out there can't deal with that, right? That scientific revelation is something that people can't contend with. And that information is present out there in the world. It's taught to people, right? Everybody learns it. And it is rendering your life kind of unimportant. However, human beings are prideful. Human beings can't imagine that their life doesn't matter, right? That your consciousness doesn't matter. That just like this brachiopod, who's now a rock from hundreds of millions of years ago. It's a rock that I found in the creek on my property, right? We have this layer of shale that's here, and it's been uncovered through erosion from water, or we had glaciers here 14,000 years ago. and maybe got scraped along by a glacier and deposited it on my property. It eventually washed out into this creek. Um, that this happened 300 million years ago, and many of the creatures in the fossil record are gone, right? Dinosaurs are gone, various mammals are gone, right? The woolly mammoths are gone, blah, 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 right? So if you're a human person who's educated today, right, your mind is educated, you've got these narratives, they seem to render your own life unimportant. If you're a prideful person, you're going to be like, no, that can't be true, right? It can't be true that humanity is going to get wiped out eventually by who knows what, or that history doesn't matter, that Julius Caesar doesn't matter, right? Julius Caesar is as important in the real sense as this creature, this brachiopod that I found in my creek. In fact, this creature preserved in this rock will probably outlast the memory of Julius Caesar a thousandfold, right? Will outlast the history of Rome and everything else a thousandfold, right? Um, and that your best scenario for being preserved eternally is to turn into a rock yourself, right? To be buried in like a shallow sea in an anoxic environment so that your bones will eventually turn into rock over the millions of years. And then maybe whatever intelligent life exists on Earth millions of years from now will find your skeleton ossified, turned into rock in some shallow seabed or something like that, right? But yeah, it these scientific revelations over the past few centuries have rendered a lot of this type of seeking foolish or nonsensical, but people still do it, and they do it because they can't imagine that they're unimportant, right? And I think that feeds into this overall story of something like Am Shinrikyo, this void, right? People are compelled to seek answers because of things like pride, right? Things like self-worth in a society that says you're worthless, in a cosmos or universe or a Earth system that says you're worthless, you're going to go extinct, blah blah blah. These cults provide an answer that counteracts that, or provide a narrative that counteracts that kind of um, fairly negative, nihilistic type story, right? Anyway, the cult seems to provide all of these answers, and then through this initiatory rite, and then through later transgressions, right, it builds the group up more and more and more. And by transgression, I mean basically getting involved in a crime that's taking you away from the overall population, making you into the chosen ones, essentially, who are going to lead humanity into the future. That was the Aum Shinrikyo story. Um, that they were special, they were chosen, and that they were going to be the survivors of the apocalypses that they were going to then precipitate. So they went on to murder and kill people, right? There were these contending cults in Japan, plus there were anti-cult people in Japan at the time, and they were being investigated, they were being exposed by journalists, etc. at the time. And this group lashed out, right? By then it was kind of a very well-funded corporation with a bunch of properties. It had publishing arm, etc. It had infiltrated the governments, and they were able to use this intelligence network that they had built to punish people who were complaining about them. Right? They actually killed a family of a person who was criticizing the group. Right? Maybe they killed multiple families who did actually. And then ultimately they did this sarin gas attack, right? I think it was sarin, might have been nerve gas, doesn't really matter, right? On a subway station. And they killed several people, right? They maimed several people, hurt them permanently. This was in 1995, right? So this group culminates in this crazy act. And, it just makes perfect sense. Like the narrative makes perfect sense, follows from all of the discussion that, yeah, sure, this is what would happen. And the group was then aggressively broken up by the Japanese government. The leadership was executed by hanging several years later, right? So this all happened in the 90s. That's when that subway gas attack was. I think it was 95, no, 94. And then the group was broken up. leadership jailed and then executed. I think they were just recently executed, just maybe a few years ago. So it took pretty much like 20 or 30 years for this death sentence to be carried out in Japan, right? So I think that Aum Shinrikyo just provides a really great example to think about, right? So how this void, when individuals are incapable of filling it themselves or occupying their time in a constructive manner and have sort of existential dread or whatever, or are tired of narratives that don't feed their fantasies, right? Like the geology narrative, for example. If it doesn't feed your fantasy, you want to come up with something else, right? Like I am really important, right? I am, the I that is the I think therefore I am mode of consciousness. I exist. I am important. I'm not going to die. People believe that kind of thing. They can't really grapple with the boring reality of existence in the 3D reality world, of physical, existence in the 3D reality world. So they kind of run into these sort of fantasies, these fantasy realms created by potentially predatory people, right? Like, or weirdos like this Shoko Asahara guy. And, they'll just be led further and further down that road to more and more extreme activities, right? I think that's a really interesting example. I think a shocking aspect of that is when you start to like look at a couple of other groups like the Nexium cult, for example, which I'm not going to get into in that much detail. You start to see like this overall pattern. They create like a corporation, recruit like specific people, right? They kind of prey upon specific types of people, um, blackmail them, bribe them, infiltrate governments, right? Build out an essentially a spy network, right? Use intelligence type operations to accrue more wealth and power, right? That's, I think, one of the interesting things about this Nexium cult, right? And I think it is particularly interesting because it reminds me a lot of the Epstein group, right? The things going on with Jeffrey Epstein. They make that look, that is the news and the media reporting on it, make it look pretty mundane, like just a prostitution, blackmail ring. But it was probably a cult as well. And you only see certain elements of it kind of spill out into the general public, right? Kind of comical elements of it. But these people, famous, wealthy people, prominent figures in academia, etc., were participants in this Jeffrey Epstein sex cult, right? And Nexium was just another version of that. And one of the participants in that was this child of a prominent, wealthy family, the owners of a major alcohol corporation, right? This Claire Bronfman lady, and she was, kind of engaging in this sort of espionage type activity. She installed the keylogger on her father's computer so they could spy on him, right? A lot of these groups end up infiltrating governments like Shinrikyo did, or they start to spy on, use private investigators and that kind of thing to spy on authorities who might be monitoring them. They start to form a sort of like government, right? They're like a proto government. And I think another group you could look at from this perspective is Zionists, right? The Zionist movement is based on this kind of apocalyptical story. It casts the Jewish people in a certain victim role, like, oh, everybody's trying to get us. We're the constantly persecuted people. We're the servants of God. We're holy people. Blah blah blah. We're certainly not unimportant. We're the most important people on earth, right? We're not like that that shell that you found in your creek. We're super important, right? As a group, we're super important. We're the children of God, the chosen ones of God. We're here on a mission to fix the earth, right? The earth is broken and it won't be healed without our extreme efforts, etc. Right? So you start to see this sort of pattern emerge in these cult-like groups, extreme groups, right? And then I think it's interesting to compare that whole crazy thing, right? These extreme versions of such groups with religions in general, like Catholicism or different versions of Christianity, right? And you see, okay, it gives you this narrative, this pretty generic, boring narrative about the way things work, right? Oh, there was a super important character, Jesus, or there's a super important figure like God or whatever, this God, monotheistic God. And therefore, the universe is all structured and has meaning. All the questions are answered, right? They're answered in a canonical fashion. They're answered in this sort of corporate legalistic fashion as well, right? And what I mean by that is the canonical story, that is the official narrative of the way the universe works, right? The official comic book of these different faiths is enshrined in law, right? In this group that has appointed themselves as the curators of all this information. So Christianity itself, or the Catholic Church itself, starts off with essentially like a board of directors meeting where they decide, okay, all of this, this set of random stories from the Mediterranean world is going to be included in our official comic book, right, the Bible. And right, they set all this stuff out there, right, this kind of official curriculum, official story of the Catholic Church, and then proceed to uh, inflict it on especially the European population by law. And it's useful also to the kings of the time, right? The medieval kings, early medieval kings, because it takes the individual who was previously a member of a tribe, right? Like you might be a Swabian, you might be a Frank, you might be whatever. It takes a member of a tribe, that these tribes that were kind of moving around in Europe in those days, and turns you into a generic individual who is a believer in this new group, new corporate belief system, right? The Catholic Church belief system. So in that case, you are force fed the story, the narrative that tells you where you fit in the world and how it all works together, right? You have this sort of systematic, canonical explanation for the world, and this void, right? This problem, this divide by zero problem that you have as a human being, that is your mind, this problem that you have as a human being is solved by fiat, right? These are the answers. Here they are. You can't have any other beliefs. If you have other beliefs, like say the Cathars in southern France, who have a completely different take on the world, even though they're Christians. If you're a competitor to the official corporate belief system, you get wiped out, right? So anyway, I think this is a pretty good starting point for this channel, right? This is a pretty good starting point for things I'm going to talk about in the future. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a good day.